There is a kind of quiet that does not feel like rest. You know this quiet. It arrives at the end of a long day, when the lights finally go down and the world outside goes still. And instead of peace, there is a heaviness, something beneath the surface that does not have a name yet, but has been there for a while. Tonight, you do not have to name it. You do not have to fix it. You do not have to do anything at all. We are simply going to sit with something together and see what becomes clearer in the stillness. There are two kinds of pain that people carry. The first kind is obvious: the stress, the friction, the specific thing that went wrong today. It announces itself. It has a cause you can point to, a beginning and, eventually, an end. The second kind is quieter. It does not always have a story attached. It shows up in the way you hesitate before speaking, in the way you apologize without quite knowing why, in the way a night that should feel restful feels instead like waiting for something you cannot name. That second kind of pain is what we are going to follow tonight. Two thinkers spent their lives doing exactly that, following the quiet pain to its source. One was a physician who worked for decades with people the world had mostly given up on: addicts, refugees, patients with illnesses that medicine alone could not explain. The other was a Swiss psychiatrist who descended into the depths of his own mind and came back with something that looked like a map. Gabor Maté spent his career asking a different question than most doctors. Not, "What is wrong with you?" but "What happened to you?" He found that the body carries what the mind has been asked to forget, that the behaviors and illnesses we often call problems are usually adaptations, the mind doing exactly what it learned to do to survive something it was never meant to carry alone. Carl Jung followed the inner life from a different direction. He was interested in what we refuse to see in ourselves. He called that hidden territory the shadow. He believed the unconscious is not an enemy. It is a guide, and when it goes unheard, it does not go away. It speaks through the body, through our dreams, through the patterns that repeat in our lives, until we finally stop and listen. Tonight, we follow both of them, not into anything frightening, into something honest. Your body has been keeping a record. That is the first thing worth knowing tonight. Not as an accusation, but as an invitation. Because when we begin to read that record with curiosity instead of shame, what felt like burden starts to feel like information. And information, unlike suffering, can be understood. And what is understood can, over time, be set down. There is also a part of you, and this will become clearer as the hours pass, that learned at some point to disappear, not physically, inwardly. It made itself small so something more important could survive. It has been patient. It has been waiting for a night like this. Let your body rest in whatever is holding it right now. Feel the weight of your shoulders. Let them drop, just slightly. Let the next breath come on its own schedule. You do not have to arrive anywhere tonight. You just have to be here. And we begin. Chapter 2. What trauma really is. Most of us carry a picture of trauma that is too small. We think of it as catastrophe, war, disaster, the kind of event that makes the news and leaves no room for argument. And those things are trauma, without question. But they account for only a small portion of what the word actually describes. Gabor Maté spent years studying what trauma does to the human body and the human mind. And one of the most important conclusions he reached was this: trauma is not the event itself. It is what happens inside a person as a result of the event. Two people can experience the same difficult thing and carry it very differently. One person's nervous system processes the experience, integrates it, and moves forward. Another person's nervous system becomes stuck, bracing, vigilant, managing, long after the moment has passed. The difference is not weakness. It is not character. It has almost nothing to do with the severity of what happened. It has everything to do with what was available at the moment of impact. Was there someone present to help carry it? Was there safety to return to? Was the experience allowed to be felt? Or was it immediately buried under the pressure to keep going, to not be difficult, to be fine? This is where so much quiet suffering begins. Not in the event, but in the aftermath. Not in the wound, but in the silence around the wound. A child who falls and scrapes their knee, surrounded by people who acknowledge the pain and offer comfort, recovers quickly. A child who falls and is told to stop crying, or who falls where no one notices at all, that child learns something different. They learn that pain is a problem to be managed alone, that feelings are inconvenient, that the safest thing is to not need too much. That lesson does not go away when the child grows up. It becomes the adult who never asks for help until they collapse. The person who says, "I'm fine," so automatically that they no longer notice whether it is true. The man who has not cried in 30 years and is not sure why. This is the quiet face of trauma. Not dramatic, not visible, just present, shaping the days without ever announcing itself. Trauma does not primarily live in the mind, it lives in the body. The nervous system encodes the experience of unsafety, and it holds on to it, because its job is to keep you alive. When the threat has passed, the nervous system is supposed to return to baseline. But sometimes, when the experience was too big, too early, too alone, too prolonged, it does not return. It stays ready. It stays braced, and that bracing is exhausting. There is a reason that people who carry unprocessed pain often feel tired in ways that sleep does not fix. The body is doing something that looks, from the outside, like nothing. But on the inside, it is working constantly, scanning, monitoring, managing. That is not laziness. It is not depression. It is what it looks like when the nervous system has never received the signal that it is safe to stop. Tonight, we are going to give that signal, slowly, through understanding. Because often, the first thing the nervous system needs before it can begin to rest is not a technique. It is an explanation, a sense that what happened made sense, that the response made sense, that you are not broken. You are not broken. That is not a comfort phrase. It is a clinical observation. The responses that cause the most suffering, the vigilance, the numbness, the disconnection, the compulsions, they are intelligent adaptations. They were the right response to an impossible situation. They just got stuck. And what gets stuck can, with time and understanding, begin to move again. Chapter 3. The body keeps the story. There is a researcher named Bessel van der Kolk who spent decades studying what trauma does to the body. He found something that challenged almost everything the medical world had assumed. The brain does not store traumatic experience the way it stores ordinary memory. When we remember a pleasant afternoon or a conversation from last Tuesday, the mind retrieves the information and places it in the past. It happened, it is over, it exists now only as a thought. Traumatic memory does not always work that way. In some circumstances, the experience is stored not as a narrative with a beginning and an end, but as sensation, as posture, as muscle tension, as a heartbeat that quickens for no clear reason in a certain kind of room, with a certain quality of light, with a certain tone of voice in the background. The body remembers what the mind has been asked to forget. This is one of the most important insights in modern psychology. It is also one of the most relieving once you let it land. Think of the person who finds themselves inexplicably tense at a family gathering, even though nothing specific has been said. Or the one who freezes just for a moment when someone raises their voice in a meeting, even a voice that means no harm. Or the sleeper who wakes every morning before dawn, already alert, already scanning. These are not irrational responses. They are the body keeping a promise it made long ago. The promise to protect. Van der Kolk observed that the body keeps the score. That phrase, and the book that followed it, changed how medicine thinks about trauma. Because once you understand that trauma lives in the body, not just the mind, the path toward healing has to change too. You cannot think your way out of a body experience. You have to feel your way through it. And feeling your way through it requires safety. It requires time. And it requires the thing most survivors of quiet trauma have the hardest time accepting: compassion. Not from someone else, though that helps. From yourself. There is a version of self-compassion that sounds soft, almost dismissive, like putting a bandage on something that needs more than that. But the self-compassion that heals is not soft at all. It is precise and honest. It says, I can see what happened to you. I can see how the nervous system learned to respond. I can see why you are the way you are, and I am not going to shame you for it. That voice, the one that sees clearly and does not judge, is the beginning of what Maté calls authentic self-knowledge. And it is also, from a very different angle, the beginning of what Jung called individuation. Two men from different centuries and different disciplines pointing toward the same place. For now, let that word sit lightly, individuation. We will return to it later when we have built enough ground to stand on. Just notice, right now, where your body feels most settled, the places that are soft, the breath that is moving on its own. Let your shoulders drop. Let the jaw unclench. The story of what the body holds is not frightening. It is, ultimately, a story of remarkable intelligence. And intelligence, when finally understood, can finally rest. Chapter 4. Childhood and Emotional Survival. There is a phrase that Maté returns to again and again in his work: the cost of connection. Children are born with two drives that are, in certain circumstances, in direct conflict. The first drive is toward authenticity, toward feeling what they actually feel, expressing what is actually true, being exactly who they are in each moment. The second drive is toward attachment, toward staying connected to the adults they depend on for survival, toward not being abandoned, toward being loved. In a good enough environment, these two drives coexist. The child feels sad, the parent acknowledges the sadness, the connection holds. The child is angry, the parent can tolerate the anger without withdrawing or punishing. The connection holds. The child can be authentic because authenticity does not threaten the attachment. But in many households, not cruel ones, not even obviously difficult ones, authenticity does threaten the attachment. The parent who cannot tolerate their child's anger sends a clear signal, even without words. Your anger is too much. The parent who rewards the calm, compliant child and withdraws from the difficult one teaches without speaking. Certain parts of you are acceptable and certain parts are not. The child, who cannot survive without the parent, makes the only rational choice available. They begin to manage their authentic feelings. They suppress the anger. They hide the sadness. They perform the calm. They learn to read the room before they learn to read. This is not pathology. This is survival. But the survival strategy that protected the child does not automatically dissolve when the child grows into an adult. The adult who learned to suppress their anger still suppresses it, not because they choose to, but because the nervous system encoded the lesson at a level deeper than choice. The adult who learned to perform calm still performs it, even in relationships where real calm would serve them better. Maté spent years sitting with people in exactly this position. Adults who had become so skilled at emotional management that they could not locate their own feelings anymore. People who would say, "I don't know what I want," and mean it genuinely. People who were so fluent in the language of others' needs that they had forgotten they had needs of their own. He noticed something important about these people. They were often extraordinarily capable, successful in many cases, high-functioning. The suppression had served them well in the world, but at a cost. The cost was felt most clearly in the body, in illness that arrived without warning, in exhaustion that did not respond to rest, in a persistent sense that something was missing, not outside, but inside. Think of someone you know, or think of yourself, who has spent years being the person who holds everything together, who is reliable and strong and fine, who does not ask for too much, who has learned to need very little. There is something extraordinary about that person. There is also something that has been asked to wait a very long time. Tonight, it does not have to wait. Let your jaw soften. Let the muscles around your eyes release. Whatever you have been holding together today, you can let it rest for now. Chapter 5, Attachment Before Identity. Before we know who we know whether we are safe. That is not a philosophical point, it is biological. The infant brain, in its earliest weeks and months, is building the foundational architecture that will shape every relationship, every emotional response, and every sense of self that follows. And what it is building that architecture around is one central question: is the world a place that responds to me? When the answer is yes, when the cry brings comfort, when the distress brings presence, when the need is met with consistency, the nervous system learns something essential. It learns that connection is possible, that others can be relied upon, that the world has some capacity for warmth. When the answer is inconsistent, when comfort comes sometimes and not others, when needs are met at random, when the parent is present one day and absent the next, the nervous system learns a different lesson. It learns that connection is unreliable, and so it must be either desperately sought or defended against. The psychologists who study this call it attachment theory. The names most associated with it, John Bowlby, Mary Ainsworth, devoted their careers to mapping what happens when the earliest bonds are secure and what happens when they are not. But what Mate added to this understanding was the link between early attachment patterns and what the body does with them later. The attachment style we develop in childhood does not stay confined to childhood. It becomes the invisible grammar of our relationships, the rule beneath the rule, the thing we never agreed to but cannot seem to escape. The person with anxious attachment monitors others constantly. Is she still there? Is he still interested? Did I say something wrong? The hypervigilance exhausts them. It also pushes away exactly the connection they are reaching for. The person with avoidant attachment tells themselves they do not need much. They are fine alone. they are self-sufficient, and they may genuinely believe it until the moment they are sick or afraid or falling apart in a way they cannot manage alone, and they find they have no idea how to ask for what they need. Neither of these is a character flaw. Both are reasonable adaptations to what was available. And here is the gentle paradox. The pattern that protected us in childhood often becomes the pattern that makes adult intimacy the hardest thing in the world. The anxious person reaching urgently for reassurance often creates the distance they fear. The avoidant person, protecting their self-sufficiency, often finds that it calcifies into a loneliness they cannot name or admit. Before we can change these patterns, we have to see them with curiosity rather than shame. We have to understand that the child who developed them was doing something brilliant, something necessary. And we have to extend that same understanding to the adult who is still quietly running those old programs. There is a question worth holding gently tonight, not to answer yet, just to carry. What did you learn about connection in the earliest years? Not the explicit lesson, the felt one, the one in the body. We will return to it. Notice the breath moving, in and out, without effort. The body breathes itself. You do not have to make it happen. Let that be enough, just for a moment. Chapter 6, Authenticity or Belonging. There is a moment that Maté describes as one of the most formative in a human life. It does not look dramatic. It often happens in an ordinary room between an ordinary parent and an ordinary child. The child feels something: anger, fear, sadness, excitement, something real and present and alive in their body. And the parent, for whatever reason, their own unprocessed pain, their own exhaustion, their own fear of strong emotion, cannot meet that feeling where it lives. They do not have to be cruel. They do not have to punish. They simply have to be unavailable, a slight withdrawal, a look that says too much, a change of subject, a distraction offered in place of presence. And the child, reading the room with the exquisite sensitivity of someone whose survival depends on it, makes a rapid calculation. Without words, without consciousness, just the nervous system doing the math. Authenticity or belonging. I can have one, but not both right now. And the nervous system almost always chooses belonging because belonging for a child is not a preference, it is oxygen. So the authentic feeling gets suppressed. It goes underground. And in its place, the child produces whatever is required. The smile, the compliance, the performance of being fine. Now, this happens to almost everyone to some degree. The question is not whether you made this choice. The question is how often and at what cost. Because each time the authentic self is suppressed in favor of belonging, something accumulates. Not bitterness exactly, something more like distance. A gap between who you are and who you are allowed to be. And that gap over years, over decades, can become a kind of quiet suffering that is very hard to locate. because it does not look like pain from the outside. It looks like being well adjusted, like being easy to be around, like not causing problems. But inside, there is a persistent sense of unreality, of going through motions, of performing a self rather than inhabiting one. Maté saw this most clearly in his patients with serious illness. He noticed again and again that they shared a particular profile. They were often the most capable, the most accommodating, the least likely to complain. They had spent decades giving more than they received, tolerating more than they expressed, being more available to others than they were to themselves. And their bodies, at some point, had simply said no, not as punishment, as information. There is a question worth sitting with here, not to answer tonight, just to carry. When was the last time you felt completely yourself? Not performing, not managing, not adjusting to the room. Just you, fully present in your own body, saying what was true. If the question feels unfamiliar, that is all right. It is still a good question. Let your hands rest open. Let the weight of the evening settle. You are not expected to have answers tonight, only to listen. Chapter 7. The Trauma of Adaptation. There is a man we can imagine, though his life is not unusual. He built a successful career by becoming exactly what was needed. In meetings, he reads the room instantly and shapes himself to fit. At home, he manages the mood. With friends, he is reliable, entertaining, always fine. He has never been in what he would call a crisis. He has never had a breakdown. He is, by all conventional measures, doing well. But there is a workshop in his garage where he spends most of his free time alone, and a schedule that is never empty, not because the tasks are endless, but because stillness makes something rise in him that he has never learned to name. He is not aware of this. Not consciously, he just knows that he prefers to be busy. Maté would recognize this man immediately. He would recognize the workshop not as a hobby, but as a haven, and the busy schedule not as productivity, but as anesthesia. This is what he calls the trauma of adaptation. Not a single wound, not a catastrophe, but the cumulative cost of spending a lifetime being what the situation required at the expense of what was actually felt. The adaptation itself was intelligent. The man learned to read rooms early because he had to, because the room required it. He learned to suppress his own needs because needs were, in some environment he inhabited, an inconvenience. He learned that busyness was valued and stillness was suspect. These were not random lessons. They came from somewhere real. They served a purpose. But the adult who is still running those lessons is not a child in a difficult room anymore. He is a man in a life of his own making. And the tools he built for survival are slowly, quietly becoming the walls of a smaller and smaller world. The tragedy is not dramatic. It is the opposite of dramatic. It is the man who retires after 40 years and finds, on the first Monday morning with no alarm, that he does not know what he actually wants. Because wanting was not something he was taught to do. He was taught to perform, to provide, to endure. And without the structure, something surfaces, something that has been waiting. This moment, the Monday morning with no alarm, the empty weekend, the night that is too quiet, this is not a crisis. Even if it feels like one, it is an opening, what Mate would call the return of the authentic self, knocking on the door after a long time away. And the only way to open that door is the thing most people in that position have the hardest time doing: sitting still with what comes. Just for a moment, right now, notice if there is anything you have been moving away from, any stillness you have been filling, any feeling you have been keeping busy enough not to feel. You do not have to do anything with it. Just notice it. That noticing is where something begins. Chapter 8. Why the Body Says No. The title of one of Mate's most important books is a question disguised as a statement. When the body says no, the body does say no. And what it is often refusing is the continuation of a pattern that the conscious mind has been willing to endure. The science behind this is worth understanding. The body and the immune system are not separate from the mind in the way medicine once assumed. The stress hormones that flood the body during emotional suppression, cortisol, adrenaline, the others, have profound effects on physiology over time. They suppress immune function. They inflame. They interfere with the cellular processes that keep the body in balance. A person who spends years suppressing anger, not just choosing not to express it, but genuinely not allowing themselves to feel it, is doing something to their body that the body eventually registers. Not as a moral judgment, as a load-bearing structure that has been asked to carry too much for too long. Your body has been keeping a record. That was the first thing we said tonight. This is what that means in practice. Mate spent years collecting the stories of patients with conditions that medicine had labeled without clear cause. And in those stories, he noticed a pattern that appeared again and again. These were people who had learned, often very early, to not say no, to not express anger, to prioritize others' feelings over their own, to be the reliable one, the strong one, the one who does not burden anyone. And their bodies, at some point, had said the no that they could not. This is not blame. It is a clinical observation that points toward something useful. The path toward physical health and the path toward emotional wholeness are not separate roads. They lead to the same place. Learning to say no gently, honestly, without the catastrophizing that often accompanies the first attempts, is not just an act of self-assertion. It is an act of care for the body that has been waiting for permission to stop bracing. The same is true of rest. True rest, not the rest of exhaustion, but the rest of genuine safety, requires the nervous system to believe that nothing terrible will happen if you stop monitoring, if you stop managing, if you let the evening be quiet without filling it. That belief, for many people, takes time to build. We are building it tonight. Notice the weight of your body where it rests right now. The pressure against whatever surface holds you. The simple fact of being held. Nothing is required of you in this moment. Let that be true. Just for now. Chapter 9. Stress, Illness, and Silence. There is a study that changed how many researchers understand illness. It is called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. It surveyed more than 17,000 adults about their childhood experiences: abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, parental mental illness. Then it tracked their health outcomes across decades. The findings were striking. The higher the number of adverse childhood experiences, the higher the rates of virtually every major illness in adulthood: heart disease, cancer, autoimmune conditions, diabetes, depression, addiction. The relationship was not marginal. It was consistent. More adversity in childhood, more illness in adulthood. Across populations, this study did not prove direct causation, but it established a connection that could no longer be ignored. Something about the experience of being a child in a difficult environment, something about what that does to the developing nervous system, the stress hormone systems, the immune function, leaves a trace that the body carries for decades. Mate saw in these findings the confirmation of what he had been observing in his patients for years. The silence around illness is one of its most painful dimensions. Not the illness itself, but the isolation of not being able to say what you know. Not being able to say, I think what is happening in my body has something to do with what happened in my life. I think the two are connected. For a long time, medicine had no framework for that connection, and so patients who intuited it were often dismissed. Or they dismissed themselves. It's probably nothing. I'm sure it's just stress. And kept going. Mate's contribution was to take that intuition seriously, to build a framework in which the connection between emotional life and physical health is not mystical but biological. Not blame, but information. Because once it becomes information, it becomes a place to begin. And beginning, even late, even imperfectly, even in the middle of what has already happened, is always possible. There is something worth holding in that. The idea that beginning is always available, not as a demand to act, just as a fact about time and the body. The body is remarkably patient. It will wait for understanding, and when understanding comes, it will often respond. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in the quiet way of things that are finally given room. Let your next breath be a little slower. Not forced, just allowed. Chapter 10, Addiction as Attempted Healing. There is a question that Mate says he always asks when he sits with someone struggling with addiction. He does not ask, why the addiction? He asks, why the pain? This reframing is not small, it is fundamental. Addiction, in his understanding, is not a disease of moral failure or weak will. It is not a disorder that falls from the sky onto randomly selected people. It is a response to pain that the person found no other way to manage. The substance, the behavior, the compulsion, whatever form the addiction takes, does something specific. It relieves, temporarily, an unbearable internal state. It brings calm to a nervous system that has been braced for years. It creates, for a few hours, the experience of not needing anything, of being complete, of being enough. This is not coincidence, it is biology. The reward pathways in the brain that are activated by addictive substances are the same pathways that are activated by connection, by love, by safety. The person who was not given enough of the latter often finds their way to the former. It does not make the addiction harmless, but it makes the person understandable. Think of the man who drinks, not because he enjoys being drunk, but because being drunk is the only time the vigilance stops. The woman who scrolls through her phone at midnight, not because she is interested in what she finds, but because the scrolling quiets a voice that would otherwise fill the silence. The person who works compulsively, not for ambition, but because stopping means feeling something they have never been given the tools to feel. These are not failures. They are people in pain, using the most efficient tool available to make the pain manageable. Mate found that the most effective path forward was not punishment or shame or willpower. It was exactly the opposite of those things. Compassion, curiosity, the question, what happened to you, asked and actually heard. Because when the question is finally heard, something shifts. The person who has been managing their pain alone discovers they are not alone in it. And the nervous system, which has been braced against abandonment, against judgment, against being too much, begins very slowly to soften. In that softening is the beginning of something more sustainable than the addiction, the beginning of genuine connection with another person and with themselves. This is where the two kinds of pain we mentioned at the start begin to converge. The surface pain of today and the deeper pain that has been there much longer. Both kinds of pain are looking for the same thing, not a solution, a witness. And witnessing yourself with honesty and without cruelty is one of the hardest and most healing things a person can do. Let your jaw unclench. Let the shoulders settle. Chapter 11. The question behind compulsion. There is a particular kind of night that many people know. The work is done, or as done as it is going to be. The house is quiet. There is nothing left to manage, and instead of relaxing, you find yourself doing something, anything, to not be still. Checking the phone, eating without hunger, watching something you are not interested in, reorganizing something that did not need reorganizing. This is not laziness. It is not weakness. It is a question being asked by the nervous system, and the compulsion is the nervous system's attempt to avoid hearing the answer. What will I find if I stop? For some people, the answer is grief. For others, loneliness. For others, a low, persistent anxiety that has been running in the background for so long that they have forgotten it is not just who they are. Mate would say, the compulsion is not the problem. The compulsion is the signal. And the question it is pointing toward is worth asking. What is the pain that this behavior is managing? When we ask that question, really ask it, not as a way to justify the behavior, but as a way to understand it, something changes. The compulsion becomes less automatic. It becomes visible. And things that are visible can be worked with in a way that invisible things cannot. This is not a demand for immediate change. Changing these patterns takes time, and time takes patience. And patience requires the belief that you are worth being patient with. That belief, for many people who grew up learning to suppress their authentic needs, is genuinely difficult. It feels almost selfish, almost self-indulgent. But here is something worth considering. The person who can finally sit with their own pain, who can feel the grief or the loneliness or the anxiety without immediately reaching for a way to manage it, becomes a different kind of person in the world. More present, more available, less defended. Not because they have more willpower, because they have more compassion for themselves, which, it turns out, is the root of compassion for anyone else. Tonight, we are not asking you to do anything difficult. We are just inviting you to notice, to sit with whatever is here just for a moment before we continue. And from here, we turn to a different kind of explorer. One who went looking for the pain not in the body or the behavior, but in the darkness beneath consciousness itself. Chapter 12, Jung and the Unconscious. In 1913, Carl Jung was in crisis. He had just ended his relationship with Sigmund Freud, the man who had been both his mentor and, in some sense, his psychological father. The break was bitter. Jung was cast out of the psychoanalytic world he had helped to build. His professional reputation was damaged. His sense of direction was gone. And then something stranger happened. He began to hear voices. Not in the way that would indicate psychosis, but interior voices, images, fragments of story and myth that arrived unbidden at the edges of sleep. He was, by his own account, terrified. He was a psychiatrist. He knew what it looked like when the mind fractured, and he was not entirely certain this was different. But instead of silencing the voices, he chose to listen. He began to record what he heard. He wrote in a large red leather book, pages and pages of the imagery and stories and figures that emerged from his unconscious mind. He painted illuminations to accompany the text. For years, he showed the book to no one. It was the most private document of his life. He called it the Red Book. What he eventually understood was that the voices were not symptoms, they were material. Raw, unprocessed content from what he came to call the unconscious, the vast territory of the mind that operates below the level of awareness, shaping thoughts and feelings and choices without ever announcing itself. Jung's fundamental insight was this: the unconscious is not an empty basement. It is a living country. It has its own geography, its own inhabitants, its own logic, and what lives there does not disappear because we refuse to visit. In one of his letters he wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." He meant it literally. The person who spends their life looking outward, at achievement, at approval, at what the world requires, is, in a certain sense, sleepwalking. The interior goes unexamined. And the unexamined interior does not become neutral. It becomes the source of our symptoms, our projections, our suffering. But the person who turns inward, who makes the descent into their own unconscious with honesty and patience, awakens to something, a richer life, a more accurate self, a freedom that does not depend on circumstances. This is what Jung spent the rest of his life mapping, and it is what we follow him into now. Notice the quality of quiet around you right now, the dark that is not empty but full, the silence that contains more than it reveals. This is a good environment for what comes next. Chapter 13, The Shadow We Avoid. There is a garden. It is well tended. The paths are clean, the hedges trimmed, the flower beds full of colour. Every morning the gardener walks the same route, here and here and here. Every section receives attention. Every section is cultivated, except one corner. In the far northeast, where the wall meets the older part of the property, there is a section the gardener has never visited. Not out of laziness, out of something harder to name, a reluctance, a sense that what grows there is best left alone. The weeds in that corner grow taller every season. But something else grows there too. In the neglected corner, behind the overgrowth, there are flowers the gardener planted years ago and then forgot. Bulbs that have been waiting for light. A small wild herb, fragrant, that has persisted through neglect. The gardener does not know this, because the gardener has never gone there. This is the shadow, as Jung understood it. The shadow is not the evil in us. It is not the worst of us. It is the unacknowledged in us. Everything that did not fit into the identity we built. Everything that was discouraged or shamed or simply not allowed. Everything we became too small to hold. The child who was told that anger was unacceptable learns to push that anger into shadow. It does not disappear. It comes out sideways, in passive resistance, in sudden disproportionate outbursts, in the harsh judgment of others' anger. The part we reject in ourselves, we often attack in other people. Jung saw this projection as one of the shadow's most reliable signatures. When we feel an intense, irrational reaction to something in another person, a fury or a contempt that seems larger than the situation warrants, he suggested we look inward first. What is it in them that mirrors something we cannot accept in ourselves? This is not a comfortable exercise. It was not meant to be. But it is, for many people, one of the most liberating. Because the moment you recognize a disowned quality in yourself, really see it, without immediately condemning it, it loses some of its power. It becomes something you can work with, rather than something that works on you. And in that neglected corner, among the weeds, are the flowers. The parts of yourself that were suppressed not because they were dangerous, but because they did not fit. The creativity that was never encouraged, the tenderness that was never safe enough to show, the need that was learned to feel like weakness. These are not lost, they are waiting. If your mind is still with us, and even if it has been drifting and come back, let it rest here for a moment. There is nothing to figure out right now, just to let the idea settle. What grows in the neglected corner is not only weeds. Chapter 14, Persona and the False Self. Jung gave a name to the mask we build for the world. He called it the persona. The word comes from the Latin for the masks worn by actors in ancient theatre, the face that announces the role before a single line is spoken. Every person builds a persona. This is not a problem, it is necessary. A persona allows us to function in social life, to show up as professional at work, as reliable friend in our friendships, as capable parent in the school drop-off line. We modulate ourselves. We present an appropriate version. This is not fakery. It is social intelligence. The problem, as Jung saw it, begins when the persona is mistaken for the self. When the performance of the role becomes the only thing the person knows how to be. When the mask that was built for the world has been worn for so long that the face beneath it has become unfamiliar. When someone asks, "Who are you really?" and the honest answer is, "I am not entirely sure." This is not unusual. For many people, the persona has been in development since childhood, since the moment they first intuited what the household required. The competent one, the calm one, the funny one who keeps things light, the responsible one who does not need anything. These roles were built in response to real conditions, and they served real purposes. But the self that was there before the role, the unmanaged, uncertain, genuinely feeling self, did not disappear. It went into shadow, and shadow does not stay quiet forever. Maté and Jung arrive at this point from different directions, but they meet at the same place. The person who has spent decades performing a self, whether through emotional suppression, through compulsive productivity, through chronic accommodation of others, is a person who has become a stranger to themselves. And the path back is not through performance, it is through the very thing the persona was built to avoid. Vulnerability. The willingness to be unknown. The willingness to not know. This sounds simple. It is among the hardest things, because the persona, by the time it is fully formed, feels like safety. Dropping it feels like exposure, like standing in a room without walls. But what is discovered on the other side of that exposure, gradually, with support, with time, is not the emptiness the persona was protecting against. It is the self that was there all along, smaller than the performance perhaps, less polished certainly, but real. And real, it turns out, is what we have been hungering for. Chapter 15. Trauma in the Shadow. There is something specific that happens when trauma goes unacknowledged. It does not stay in the past. It does not fade with time. It goes into shadow. And shadow, as we now understand, is not a storage room. It is a living system. What enters it does not become inert. It becomes active in ways we cannot see directly, shaping our reactions, our relationships, our dreams, our bodies. Think of a moment in your own life when something happened that you were never allowed to fully feel. Not because you were asked to suppress it, but because the situation required you to keep going. The grief that had to wait because others needed you. The fear that had to be managed because fear was not acceptable in that environment. The anger that had to be swallowed because expressing it would have cost something you could not afford to lose. That feeling went somewhere, not away, into shadow. And from there, it continues to do its work. It shows up in the person who becomes inappropriately angry about minor inconveniences, because the shadow anger has been building pressure for years. It shows up in the person who feels a sudden, inexplicable sadness in response to beautiful music, because the shadow grief has found a small opening. It shows up in the body, in the tension and the exhaustion that sleep cannot fix. There is something strange and relieving about what Jung observed next. The traumatic content in the shadow does not want to destroy us. It wants to be acknowledged. It wants to be brought into the light of consciousness, where it can be seen for what it is. The thing you have been avoiding does not want to hurt you. It wants to be understood. Think of a moment when you were surprised by your own emotional reaction, when something small produced a response that felt too large, a comment that should not have stung but did, a piece of news that should not have mattered as much as it did. Those moments are often the shadow's knock on the door, not to drag you back into the past, to invite you into a wider understanding of your own interior. This is the beginning of what Jung called shadow work, not a dramatic confrontation, just attention, just the willingness to say, something is here that I have not yet seen clearly, and I am going to look at it gently, without judgment. That willingness is not easy, but it is possible, and it is the beginning of something Jung called becoming whole. Let your next breath come slowly. Feel the weight of the evening settled around you. Chapter 16. Dreams of the Wounded Mind. Jung paid attention to dreams in a way that contemporary psychology has mostly set aside. And it is worth understanding why. He did not believe that dreams were random noise from a sleeping brain. He believed they were the language of the unconscious, the way the deeper mind communicates with the surface self in images and stories and symbols. Because images and stories and symbols can carry what ordinary language cannot. For those who have experienced trauma, dreams often take on a particular quality. Repetitive, vivid, sometimes disturbing, sometimes inexplicable. The body carries the experience, and at night, when the conscious mind releases its grip, the stored experience surfaces in the form of images. This is not malfunction. It is the nervous system trying to complete something, trying to process an experience that was never fully processed, never felt all the way through, never held, never integrated into the narrative of the self. The recurrent dream is often the unconscious returning to the same unfinished material, trying again and again to find a way through. Van der Kolk's research supports this understanding from a different direction. The brain during dream sleep appears to be doing a kind of processing work, connecting experiences to existing networks of meaning. When trauma is present, this processing is disrupted. The traumatic material stays isolated, unconnected, unintegrated. This is why some people with significant painful histories feel, even after decades, that the past is present. Not as a memory they can access and set aside, but as something more immediate. A body that does not know it is safe yet. A mind that still runs the old scripts. Jung would say, listen to the dreams, not literally, not as prophecy or instruction, but as communication, as the unconscious trying to tell you something you have not been able to hear in waking life. What images return to you in sleep? What feelings linger in the mornings after certain nights? These are not to be analyzed right now, in the dark, in the quiet. But they are worth noticing, worth carrying into a morning, a conversation, a moment of curiosity, because what the unconscious says in images is often what the conscious mind could not yet afford to say in words. And eventually, gently, slowly, in safety, the words come. Chapter 17. Complexes and Repeating Pain. Jung had a name for the patterns that repeat. He called them complexes, not in the common sense of the word. In his technical sense, a complex is a cluster of experiences, emotions, images, and reactions that have gathered around a central wound and developed a kind of autonomous energy. Think of the person who, every time they are criticized, reacts with the same disproportionate shame they felt as a child, being corrected by a parent who used humiliation as a tool. The adult situation is different. The adult has different resources. But something in the response bypasses those resources and connects directly to the older experience. That is a complex at work. Or the person who, in every intimate relationship, finds themselves repeating the same arc. Initial warmth, then distance, then the familiar pain of feeling abandoned, even when the partner has not actually abandoned them. The complex generates its own narrative. It sees what it expects to see. It confirms what it already believes. This is not stupidity or weakness. It is the way the psyche organizes experience around earlier wounds that were never fully healed. Mate would recognize this pattern immediately. The complex in his framework is the nervous system's encoded learning from a difficult early experience, replaying the adaptive response because it has never received the signal that the danger has passed. Both men would say the same thing about these repeating patterns. They will not change through effort or willpower alone. They require something more fundamental. They require the experience of being met differently, of a relationship with another person or with one's own interior that does not confirm the old wound. This is one reason why genuine healing often requires relationship, not any particular formal structure, but the genuine presence of another human being who sees you clearly and does not flinch. And sometimes the beginning of that kind of relationship is what happens in a night like this. When the quiet is long enough and the patience is deep enough, and something that has been running its old script for years is finally just noticed, without judgment, without the urge to fix it, just seen. Noticing without judgment is already a different response than the complex expected. And different responses over time are how the pattern begins to change. Chapter 18, Anxiety as Inner Signal. It is 3 a.m. The room is dark. The breathing beside you or around you or in the silence has settled into rest, and your mind is running. Not thinking exactly, running through the scenarios of tomorrow, next week, next year, through the thing you said 3 days ago and should have said differently, through the quiet accumulation of everything that could go wrong. This is familiar. This is almost everyone's experience at some point. The mind at 3 a.m. is a different instrument than the mind at noon. It has less to hold it down, less distraction, less management, and so it runs. But here is the thing worth understanding about that 3 a.m. mind. It is not predicting. It is not even primarily worrying. It is rehearsing control. It is running through scenarios because the nervous system believes that if it can anticipate every possibility, it can prevent the worst. This is a kindness the mind is trying to perform, a form of love even. Stay ready, it is saying. Keep going. I am watching out for you. It is just not very good at distinguishing between the present and the past, between real dangers and remembered ones. between what actually threatens you now and what threatened you then in a room you have long since left. Jung observed that anxiety is often the dizziness of freedom, that the feeling we interpret as danger is sometimes not about external threat, but about internal possibility, about choices not yet made, about the gap between who we are and who we are becoming, about the weight of being free to choose and not knowing what to choose. The anxious person is not always the person in danger. They are often the person at the edge of something new, of an old pattern ending, of a new understanding beginning. The anxiety is not a warning. It is a signal that something is being asked of the self that the self has not yet learned to give, and that asking, uncomfortable as it is at 3 a.m, is the voice of something alive in you, something that is not giving up, which does not make it easier to feel, but it makes it less frightening to hold. Your shoulders, let them drop. Your jaw, let it soften. The 3 a.m. mind will run its course. It always does. And beneath it, the body knows how to rest. Chapter 19. The Inner Critic at Night. There is a voice that knows you better than almost anyone. It knows the exact words that will land hardest. It knows which fears are real and which you have managed to suppress. It knows every failure, every embarrassment, every moment you wished you had been different. And at night, with the defenses down and the day's distractions gone, it speaks. The inner critic is one of Jung's most practically understood concepts, even if it goes by different names in different traditions. He saw it as part of the shadow, specifically the internalized voices of the people who judged us, who shamed us, who set the standard we have never quite met. The critical parent who was never satisfied, the teacher who pointed out your mistake in front of the class, the peer group whose approval required constant calibration. Over years, these external voices become internal ones, so internal that they feel like your own voice, so familiar that they feel like truth. But they are not truth, they are history. They are the voices of other people's fears and wounds, internalized and turned inward. Mate would see the inner critic as a direct descendant of the authenticity-belonging conflict. The child who suppressed their authentic self in favor of approval does not simply stop needing that approval. They internalize the gaze of the approving authority. They build an internal judge who does the monitoring that was once done externally. This is why the most self-critical people are often people who received the most conditional love. People who learned early that they had to earn their place. That love was not a given, but a performance review. The inner critic is doing its best. It was built to keep you safe, to keep you from making mistakes that might cost you connection. But it often overshoots. It critiques not just the behavior, but the person. It generalizes from one failure to a comprehensive indictment. And at night, without the structure of the day to hold it back, it does its most thorough work. What would it mean to relate to that voice differently? Not to silence it. Silencing an inner critic often just makes it louder, but to see it for what it is. A frightened voice that learned to criticize because it was criticized. A part of you that is trying in its clumsy way to help you avoid pain. You could, if you wanted, say to it, "I see where you came from. You do not have to work so hard tonight." That is not weakness. That is the beginning of a different kind of inner life. Chapter 20. Depression and frozen feeling. There is a particular kind of depression that does not look like sadness. It looks like numbness, like a day that passes without texture, like going through all the motions correctly and feeling nothing, like the absence of absence. Not pain, but not pleasure either. Just a grey persistence. Mate has observed that depression, in many cases, is not the presence of something toxic, but the absence of something essential. It is what happens when the emotional life has been suppressed for long enough that the mechanism of feeling itself begins to shut down. This makes a certain dark sense. If anger is not safe, and sadness is not safe, and vulnerability is not safe, the system may eventually decide to stop generating feelings at all. Not as a choice, as a shutdown, but the system never shuts down entirely. And the irony of depression is that often beneath the numbness there is a great deal of feeling. Feeling that has nowhere to go. Feeling that has been locked in place for so long that it has forgotten how to move. Jung believed that the energy locked in depression does not disappear. It is there, available, waiting for the conditions that will allow it to move again. The therapeutic question, the question both Mate and Jung in their different ways point toward, is not how do we eliminate the numbness, but what is the feeling beneath the numbness, and what does it need? Because often, when that feeling is finally reached, when the grief beneath the depression is finally given room, when the anger beneath the numbness is finally acknowledged, something shifts. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the frozen thing begins to thaw, and the thawing, even when it initially hurts, is a form of aliveness. Aliveness is not comfort. It is something more essential than comfort. It is the sense of being genuinely present in your own life, in your own body, in your own experience. If you have known the grey flatness we are describing, know this: you are not broken by it. The system is doing exactly what it learned to do, and systems can learn new things. Just for this moment, let the body be exactly as it is. Whatever is here is welcome. There is a quieter layer beneath that flatness, and it is not empty. Chapter 21, The Wounded Healer. There is a figure from ancient mythology that both Jung and Maté, in different words, return to. The wounded healer. In Greek mythology, The centaur Chiron was struck by a poisoned arrow and could not be healed. Unlike mortal creatures, he could not die and be released from his pain. Unlike gods, he could not simply recover. He lived with his wound indefinitely, and from that wound he became the greatest healer of his age. Asclepius, the god of medicine himself, was Chiron's student. What Chiron carried in his body, the knowledge of pain that does not end, the intimate understanding of suffering from the inside, gave him something that no amount of study could provide. Empathy rooted in experience. Wisdom that came not from theory, but from living with what would not heal. Jung was interested in this figure because he saw it in the therapeutic relationship. The practitioner who has not done their own work, who has not descended into their own shadow, who has not sat with their own unprocessed pain, cannot fully accompany another person into theirs. There is a glass wall. The presence is professional, but not intimate. The understanding is intellectual, but not felt. But the person who has wrestled with their own darkness, who has come through their own suffering with something learned, that person can accompany from somewhere deeper, not as someone who has the answers, but as someone who knows the territory. There is another figure from the same territory. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist in Vienna who was taken, along with his family, to the concentration camps. He arrived at Auschwitz carrying a manuscript he had spent years writing. The manuscript was taken from him at the gate. And in the camps, stripped of everything, his family, his manuscript, his freedom, his name, he did something extraordinary. He imagined himself in those darkest moments, standing in a warm lecture hall years later, teaching what he had learned from suffering. He held that image as an anchor through the worst of it. And when the war ended, there he stood, doing exactly that. He observed that those who survived the camps most often had something to live for, a person, a task, a meaning that reached beyond the immediate horror. And that suffering, when given meaning, does not disappear, but it changes its quality. It becomes something a person can stand in relation to, rather than simply drown in. The wound does not disqualify. When finally seen and acknowledged, it educates, it deepens, it connects. Chapter 22: Shame, Secrecy, and Splitting. Shame is one of the most difficult emotions to sit with because it does not just describe something we did. It makes a claim about who we are. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. That distinction matters enormously. Guilt, as painful as it is, points toward a behavior that can potentially be changed. It connects to the specific act and to the possibility of repair. Guilt says, here is a place to begin. Shame says nothing of the kind. Shame says the problem is not the act. The problem is you. And you is not something that can be changed with an apology or a course of action. This is why shame is so often the companion of secrecy. The shameful thing must be hidden, because if it is seen, the self will be revealed as what shame has been insisting it is all along: deficient, unworthy, not enough. And so the split occurs. The self that is shown to the world, and the self that is kept in shadow. The competent, functioning, acceptable self, and the terrified, hiding self. Mate found this split in almost everyone he worked with who carried significant pain, not because they were lying to the world, but because the true self, the vulnerable, unmanaged, feeling self, was experienced as too dangerous to reveal, too likely to cost the connection it most needed. Jung would have called this a particular kind of shadow condition. The split is not between good and evil, but between accepted and unaccepted, between what has been given permission and what has been exiled. And the exile waits. There was a person in a quiet therapy office one afternoon who was asked a single question that stopped them cold. What would you say to yourself if you spoke the way you speak to your best friend? They opened their mouth and could not answer, not because they did not understand the question, but because they had never tried. The voice they used for themselves was so different from the voice they used for the people they loved that the comparison felt almost absurd. That gap between the kindness extended outward and the harshness turned inward is often the exact size of the shadow, the exact size of what has been exiled and what has been sitting in the dark, waiting to be welcomed back. You do not have to do that welcoming tonight. You just have to know it is possible. Let your breath slow. Let the weight of the evening settle around you. If you have been with us for a long time now, and your mind has drifted into sleep and come back, welcome back. What follows is the part of the journey that matters most. Chapter 23, Emotional Healing Through Awareness. Here is something that might seem counterintuitive. Awareness is not passive. It is one of the most active, most transformative things a human being can do. When we bring conscious attention to something that has been operating in shadow, a feeling, a pattern, a long-held belief about our own unworthiness, something begins to change. Not because we have fixed it, because we have seen it. Mate speaks often about the capacity for self-observation without self-judgment. He means the ability to look at one's own behavior, one's own emotional patterns, one's own reactions, and see them clearly, without the layer of shame that usually arrives with that seeing. This is harder than it sounds. For most people, self-observation comes automatically bundled with self-criticism. I notice I just got angry, and I immediately feel bad about getting angry. I notice I just reach for my phone instead of sitting with the discomfort, and I immediately tell myself I should be better than that. The self-criticism does not help the healing. It often interrupts it, because shame drives things back into shadow, and shadow is exactly where they were. What both Maté and Jung point toward is something more spacious, a capacity to see oneself with the same curiosity and compassion one might extend to a close friend. Not excusing, not justifying, simply seeing. When a feeling is seen, genuinely witnessed by your own consciousness, it does something unexpected. It moves. The grief that has been held in place by the refusal to feel it begins, when witnessed, to flow, slowly, not dramatically, but the frozen thing thaws. The thing that was stuck begins, incrementally, to move through. This is what your body has been waiting for. Not a technique, not a resolution, simply the willingness to look. And here is the quieter truth beneath that. The fact that you are here in this hour, carrying these ideas through the night, that is already a form of awareness, a form of witness. You have been sitting with something difficult without turning away from it. That matters. It is already doing something. You are not at the beginning of this work. You are somewhere in the middle of it. And the middle, it turns out, is exactly where the real movement happens. Chapter 24, Compassion instead of control. For much of our lives, we are taught that the way to manage difficult feelings is to control them. Don't cry. Don't get angry. Don't be afraid. Think rationally. Keep it together. Stay strong. And of course, these are lessons delivered with the best of intentions. They are also, in many cases, lessons that teach us to be at war with ourselves. Because feelings are not enemies. They are information. They arise for reasons. They carry content. They are the body and the nervous system speaking in the only language they have. And when we learn to control them rather than understand them, we do not actually eliminate them. We drive them underground. We put them into shadow. And from shadow, they do not disappear. They do the work they needed to do, but from a place where we cannot see them doing it. Mate's most consistent argument across all of his work is this: the solution to human suffering is not control, it is compassion. Not the soft, sentimental version of compassion that asks nothing and enables everything. The honest, clear-eyed version. The compassion that says, I see what happened. I see how the nervous system responded. I see why the pattern developed. And I am not going to shame you for any of it. This kind of compassion, directed inward, does something that control never can. It creates safety. And safety is what the nervous system needs before it can begin to update the old patterns. Before the body can finally exhale. Think of the difference between a parent who manages a frightened child by telling them there is nothing to be afraid of, and a parent who sits with the child in the dark and says, I see you are scared. I am here. It is okay to be scared. The first approach tries to convince the feeling away. The second approach meets the feeling where it lives. Only the second approach actually helps. You are, in a sense, the parent of your own inner life. The frightened child who learned to suppress and manage and control was doing its best. And it deserves now a different kind of response. Notice the weight of your body. Notice the breath. Notice that you are being held right now by whatever surface is beneath you, by the night, by the quiet. Nothing is required of you but presence. And presence, just this, just here, is enough. Chapter 25, Mental Health and Modern Culture. There is a question worth sitting with as we move through the later hours of this night's journey. Why, in a time of unprecedented material abundance, unprecedented access to information and connection, unprecedented medical advancement, why is the rate of anxiety, depression, addiction, and loneliness still rising? Mate's most recent work addresses this directly. The title says much of what he wants to convey: the myth of normal. His argument is that the conditions that produce trauma and emotional disconnection are not exceptional. They are, in the modern Western world, remarkably ordinary. They are built into the way we organize work, family, community, and childhood. We live in a culture that prizes productivity over presence, that measures worth by output, that offers belonging through performance rather than through authentic connection, that medicalizes distress rather than understanding its source, that treats the symptoms of disconnection without examining the conditions that produce them. He is not dismissing medicine. He is not dismissing therapy. He is saying, when a large portion of the population displays the same patterns of distress, it is worth looking not just at the individuals, but at the environment they are living in. Jung made a related observation. Just as individuals have shadow, the unacknowledged, suppressed parts of the self, societies have collective shadow, the things a culture cannot face about itself, the narratives it must maintain at the cost of truth, the culture that cannot acknowledge the impact of childhood adversity, the culture that insists on the myth of normal, that if you are not normal, you are broken, and if you are broken, the fault is yours. These cultural narratives have consequences for individuals. They generate shame where there should be understanding. They isolate where there should be connection. We are not going to solve this tonight, but naming it matters. Because when you understand that your distress is not entirely individual, that it is also a response to genuinely difficult conditions, the shame loosens just a little. You are not alone in this. You were never alone in this. The question was never, what is wrong with you? It never was. Chapter 26, The Myth of Normal Life. Consider the first week of retirement. The calendar is empty for the first time in 40 years. There is no alarm, no obligation, no role to perform, and instead of relief, there is something closer to terror. Not because the person is ungrateful, not because they are greedy for more, but because they have just discovered something they were not prepared for. The job was not just a job. It was the architecture of the self, the thing around which the answer to "Who am I?" was organized. Without it, the question hangs in the air, unanswered. Mate would recognize this immediately, not as a failure of gratitude, but as the predictable consequence of a culture that ties identity to productivity so tightly that the removal of productivity feels like the removal of self. This is the myth of normal, the idea that it is normal to work decades without examining the interior cost, that it is normal to derive all meaning from professional accomplishment, that it is normal to reach the end of a productive life and find that you have been, in certain essential ways, a stranger to yourself. These are normal conditions, but normal and healthy are not the same thing. Jung would have seen this retirement crisis as a classical individuation moment. The persona, the professional self, has been forcibly removed. And what remains is the question that was always beneath it. Who am I, really? This is frightening when it arrives without preparation, but it is also, when approached with curiosity rather than panic, one of life's most important invitations. The person in the first week of retirement has been handed something unprecedented: time. Unstructured, unscheduled, unappointed time. This is the raw material of self-discovery. It is also deeply uncomfortable for people who have been trained to fill time rather than inhabit it. But discomfort is not danger. And the question, who am I when I am not useful, is not an embarrassing question. It is perhaps the most essential question a person can ask. And the answer, when it comes gently over time, is often simpler and more reassuring than the fearful mind anticipated. You are not your roles. You are always more than what you did. Chapter 27. Family Patterns Across Generations. There is a phenomenon in psychology that has been documented with increasing clarity over the past several decades. Trauma is not only carried by the individual who experienced it, it moves through families, across generations. The parent who was not held when they cried becomes the parent who does not know how to hold. Not out of indifference, often out of genuine care and genuine bewilderment. The patterns encoded in the nervous system do not pause to consult conscious intention. They simply run. The grandmother who survived the kind of hardship that required absolute emotional containment passes something of that containment to her daughter, who passes something of it to hers. Not the memory, the posture. The nervous system's learned orientation toward difficulty. Mate explored this through the lens of attachment. Jung explored it through the lens of what he called the ancestral psyche. The idea that we inherit not just DNA, but deep patterns of response, structures of feeling that belong to something larger than the individual life. Both perspectives converge on the same practical insight. When you sit with your own patterns tonight, you are not sitting alone. You are sitting with the inheritance of everyone who shaped you, and everyone who shaped them. This is not an invitation to blame the past or the people in it. They were, almost always, doing the best they could with what they had been given. The mother who could not tolerate her child's distress was not cruel. She was probably someone whose own distress was never tolerated and who had no model for how to do it differently. Understanding this does not erase the impact, but it changes the quality of the carrying. When you understand that the pattern you inherited was not designed for you personally, that it arrived from further back than you can remember, something in the quality of self-blame begins to soften. You did not create this, you received it. And receiving something is the beginning of being able to set it down. This does not happen all at once. It often happens in the small moments, the moment you catch yourself responding in the old way and pause, the moment you choose just this once, something different, the moment you extend to yourself or someone you love a kindness that was not extended to you. These small moments accumulate. They are the way the pattern changes, through example, through repetition, through the gentle insistence that something different is possible. Chapter 28, Archetypes of Suffering. Jung believed that certain patterns of human experience are so universal, so deeply embedded in the human story across cultures and centuries, that they belong not just to the individual, but to something he called the collective unconscious. He called these universal patterns archetypes: the wounded healer, the shadow, the hero's journey, the departure from the known, the descent into darkness, the return transformed, the trickster, the sage, the abandoned child. These are not just characters in old stories. They are structures of human experience. And when we are living inside one of them, when we are in the descent phase of our own journey, or when we are carrying the inner wounded child, recognizing the archetype can provide a strange and genuine relief. You are not the first person to feel this way. You are not even the millionth. You are participating in something that has been part of being human since human beings first sat together in the dark and told each other stories. The archetype of suffering is perhaps the most universal of all. Across every culture, in every era, there are stories of people who descended into darkness and found in the darkness something that could not have been found anywhere else. The suffering that transforms is not the suffering that defeats. It is the suffering that is witnessed, felt, metabolized, and eventually not resolved, but integrated, carried differently. Frankl survived what no one should have to survive, and he arrived at a conclusion that has resonated across the decades since. Suffering that is given meaning does not disappear, but it changes its quality. It becomes something a person can stand in relation to rather than simply drown in. The meaning does not have to be grand. It does not have to be redemptive in any dramatic sense. It can be as simple as, this teaches me something about what matters. This shows me where I am actually strong. This is the experience from which, in time, I might be able to help someone who is in the same place. The wound does not disqualify. When finally seen and acknowledged, it educates, it deepens, it connects. And the quieter layer beneath all of that is this: you are not suffering alone. You are suffering in the company of every person who has ever carried something heavy and kept going anyway, which is everyone. Chapter 29, The Child Inside the Adult. You find a photograph in a drawer you have not opened in years. The face looking back at you is younger, much younger. There is something in the eyes, something open, something not yet armored, something that does not yet know what is coming. You hold the photograph for a moment longer than you expected to. And then you notice that person is not gone. That openness is still in there, somewhere, under the competence and the management and the long accumulation of coping, under the adult who knows how to handle things. Under all of it, the child is still there. This is not a sentimental idea. It is a clinical observation. The parts of ourselves that were formed in childhood, the feeling self, the needing self, the vulnerable self that had to go into hiding, they do not dissolve when we grow up. They go underground. They are held in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns that fire before we can think. Mate speaks of the process of reconnecting with that child self as one of the most fundamental acts of healing, not by going back, not by trying to undo the past, but by extending to that younger part of yourself the understanding and kindness it did not receive. The adult who cannot access their own vulnerability, who cannot feel their own grief, who cannot ask for help, who cannot be honestly afraid, is often an adult who learned at a young age that those things were not safe. The vulnerable, needy, frightened child was managed or ignored or quietly shamed into silence. And the adult is left, decades later, with enormous capability and a place where the feeling life should be. Reconnecting with that child is not about regression. It is about integration. It is saying, the part of me that was kept small for so long, I see you now. You do not have to hide anymore. What you needed then, you can begin to give yourself now. Not all at once, not dramatically, just in the small moments, the small kindnesses, the moments when the old critic rises and you choose this one time to speak more gently. And in those moments, something that has been waiting a very long time begins quietly to move toward the light. Chapter 30. Self-worth beyond performance. At some point in the night, when the defenses are low and the room is quiet, the real question surfaces. Not the practical questions of tomorrow. The quiet, fundamental one. Am I enough? Not enough for a particular task or a particular relationship. Enough as a person, fundamentally. Without the achievements, without the usefulness, without the role. This is perhaps the central wound in what Mate calls the culture of disconnection. The confusion between worth and performance. The belief, absorbed so early it does not feel like a belief, but like a fact, that value must be earned, that love is conditional, that you are acceptable when you succeed and suspect when you fail. Many people carry this belief for a lifetime without ever examining it, because it feels like common sense, because it was taught not through cruelty, but through the ordinary mechanisms of praise and withdrawal. It arrived so early and so quietly that it became the water rather than something in the water. But worth is not performance. This is not just a therapeutic position. It is a more accurate description of reality. The infant has worth before they have done a single thing. The person in the last weeks of their life has worth when they can do almost nothing. The worth is not located in the performance. It was always in the person. What happened for many of us is that we lost touch with this. We built our identities around what we could do, what we could produce, how we could be useful. And so the question, am I enough, became tangled with, am I useful enough, or am I good enough at the things that get rewarded? Jung's individuation process at its core is an attempt to distinguish the self from all of these constructions. To find, beneath the persona, beneath the shadow, beneath the accumulated roles and adaptations and defenses, the essential self, the one that was there before the performance began. That self does not have a resume, it does not have achievements. It has, in Jung's language, the quality of being genuine, of being real rather than performed. And that genuineness, when you find it, is enough. Not because it is impressive, because it is yours. If you are still here in this long night, listening, that too is real, and it is enough. If your mind has been drifting and returning, that is perfectly natural. Come back gently whenever you are ready. We are close now to the final turns of this journey. Chapter 31, Therapy and the Search for Wholeness. When someone finally decides to seek therapy, really decides, not just considers but acts, they are usually in significant pain. The threshold for asking for help with psychological suffering is, for most people, much higher than the threshold for asking for help with physical suffering. A broken bone is taken to a doctor immediately. A broken pattern of feeling can be carried alone and in silence for decades. This tells us something about the cultural shame around psychological pain, and it tells us something about what both Jung and Maté understood to be the fundamental human need that therapy, at its best, tries to meet. The need to be witnessed, not fixed, not advised, not managed or diagnosed or redirected. Witnessed. The experience of telling the truth of one's interior life to another person who receives it without judgment, without withdrawal, without the subtle signals that say, that is too much. This experience is, for many people, entirely new. They have never had it. And the having of it is, in itself, therapeutic. Not the information exchanged, not the techniques applied, the quality of being met. Jung believed the therapeutic relationship was not incidental to the healing, it was the vehicle of it. The new relationship, in which the old patterns could be activated and then receive a genuinely different response, updated the nervous system in ways that insight alone could not. Maté approached this through what he calls compassionate inquiry. The practitioner's job, in his framework, is not to have answers. It is to have the willingness to accompany, to enter the other person's world with curiosity rather than agenda, and to help them find their own understanding rather than imposing one from outside. Both of them, from their different directions, pointed toward the same fundamental truth about healing. It requires relationship, not any particular formal structure, but the genuine presence of another human being who sees you clearly and does not flinch. For some people, that relationship is found in a therapist's office. For others, in a friendship that finally goes below the surface. For others still, in a long marriage that has finally found its depth. And for some, the first step is the relationship with their own interior, the willingness to sit with themselves with the quality of attention and care they would offer someone they love. This, too, is a beginning, and beginnings are always available. Chapter 32. Individuation after trauma. Jung gave the process of becoming whole a name: individuation. It is a word worth unpacking. Individuation does not mean becoming more separate, more self-sufficient, more independent of others. It means the opposite. It means becoming more fully what you actually are, more integrated, more coherent, more genuinely yourself, rather than the self you built for the world's approval. It is a process, not an arrival. Jung was emphatic about this. There is no completion point, no day when the work is done and the self is fully known and the journey is over. The process continues until the end of life. For those who carry significant trauma, the individuation process has particular characteristics. Because the trauma interrupted the development of the authentic self at a specific point. Because certain capacities for trust, for vulnerability, for genuine connection were foreclosed early. Because the shadow carries not just the normal material of human development, but specific wounds. The individuation journey for a trauma survivor often moves through phases that feel less like growth and more like grief. The grief for what was lost, the anger about what was taken, the mourning for the self that might have developed differently in different conditions. These are not comfortable phases, but they are necessary ones. And on the other side of them, not around them, not bypassed, but through them, there is something that both Maté and Jung, from their different territories, describe in remarkably similar terms. A settledness, a sense of being at home in one's own skin, a capacity for presence that was not available when so much energy was being spent on management and defense. This does not mean the past is erased. It means the past has been integrated, carried in a different way. Jung also observed, and this is the line that has stayed with generations of readers, that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. What becomes conscious can be worked with. What remains in shadow directs us from behind a curtain we cannot see. Tonight, some of what was in shadow has been brought a little closer to the light. Not resolved, not solved, but seen, and seeing is the beginning of the rest. Chapter 33, Reclaiming the Abandoned Self. We come now to a thread we planted at the very beginning of this night. The part of you that learned to disappear, not physically, inwardly. The part that went small because being big was not safe. The authentic self, the feeling, needing, wanting, honestly afraid self that was asked in one way or another to wait. It has been patient, and reclaiming it is not an act of aggression, it is an act of return. The returning is not dramatic. It does not look like a revelation. It looks most often like small moments. The moment you say what you actually think instead of what the room seems to require. The moment you acknowledge an emotion before you manage it. The moment you ask for help without the usual elaborate apology for needing it. These are small moments, but they are not small things. Each one is a renegotiation of the oldest agreement, the agreement you made before you were old enough to know you were making it. The agreement that said authenticity in exchange for belonging. You are now old enough to renegotiate. The belonging you need now, the belonging of adult intimacy, of genuine friendship, of relationship that can hold the real you, does not require the suppression of the authentic self. It requires the expression of it. And the authentic self has not disappeared. It has been in shadow. It has been in the body. It has been in the dreams. It has been in the moments of inexplicable grief and unexpected joy, and the 3 in the morning running of the mind that, as we now understand, was often less about the surface concern and more about the old, deep longing, the longing to be known, to be met, to be enough without the performance. Mate would say the first step is compassion toward yourself and toward the child who learned to disappear. That child did something remarkably intelligent, something that protected the connection when connection was all that mattered. And Jung would say, what you finally face with honesty and without judgment begins at last to change. The abandoned self is not gone. It is here, tonight, listening. And both kinds of pain, the surface pain of today and the quieter pain that has been there much longer, when recognized, begin to ease. Chapter 34, Forgiveness without Forgetting. There is a common misunderstanding about forgiveness. People believe it means forgetting what happened, or excusing what happened, or releasing the other person from the consequences of what they did. Forgiveness does not require any of these things. Imagine someone sitting on a bench in a park in autumn. The leaves are coming down. The light is low and golden, and they are carrying a grudge that is older than some of their furniture. They have carried it for so long it has become familiar, almost comfortable, in the way that pain can become comfortable when it is old enough. It is the proof that something happened, the evidence they were wronged, the armor that says, "I will not be vulnerable to that again." And sitting with it, after all those years, they begin to see something clearly for the first time. The grudge is not protecting them from the person who hurt them. That person has moved on, or moved away, or no longer thinks about it at all. The grudge is only protecting them from themselves, from the grief beneath the anger, from the vulnerability that would have to be felt if the anger were released. Forgiveness, understood honestly, is not a gift to the person who wronged you. It is a door you open for yourself. So you can leave the room where you have been keeping the pain preserved. What happened still happened. The wrong is still real. The impact is still real. Forgiveness does not change any of that. But it releases the grip of carrying it forward. It allows the energy that has been locked into the grievance to be available for the present rather than the past. Mate would say the most difficult forgiveness is often not of another person, it is of ourselves. For the ways we failed to live up to our own values. For the choices made from fear rather than wisdom. For the years spent in the adapted self, performing a life rather than inhabiting one. That self-forgiveness is not a dismissal of what happened. It is an acknowledgement that you were doing the best you could with what you had been given. And that best, imperfect, limited, sometimes costly, was real. And it was enough. Chapter 35. Becoming whole in silence. Let us pause here for a moment. Not to summarize what we have explored, not to conclude anything, just to arrive in this particular moment, in your particular body, and let what has been said settle where it wants to settle. You have traveled through a great deal tonight, through the body and what it carries, through the shadow and what it holds, through the early years and the patterns they encoded, through the grief and the adaptation and the long, patient waiting of the authentic self. You do not have to have absorbed all of it. The parts that were meant for you will find their way. Right now, let your attention move to wherever your body feels most still. Maybe your legs, maybe your chest, maybe the back of your head against the pillow, or the hands that have been at rest through all of this. There is nothing to change, nothing to improve. Just notice what is here. If there is tightness somewhere, you do not need to release it. Just know it is there. The body will move at its own pace when it feels ready. Let your breath find its own rhythm. Not deeper, not slower, just its own. If thoughts are moving through your mind, that is fine. Let them move like water through a space that is large enough to hold them. You are not the thoughts. You are the one in whom the thoughts arise. And that one, the witness, the awareness itself, has been here all along, through every chapter of your life, through the years of adaptation and suppression and carrying, through the nights of running and the mornings of managing. It was never absent, it was just obscured. Now, for this moment, it is simply here, feeling the body present in the quiet. This is something close to what Jung meant. Who looks inside, awakes. Not awake in the sense of alert or busy, awake in the sense of genuinely present, in this body, in this moment, without the overlay of performance or management or the monitoring of what others require. Just you, the real one, still here. Think of someone whose presence makes you feel genuinely safe. A face that comes to mind without effort. The feeling of being in their company, the ease, the warmth, the sense that you can be yourself. Now offer that same quality of presence to yourself. Not because you have earned it, not because you have been good enough, or healed enough, or figured enough out. Because you are a human being in a body, and you have been carrying something heavy for a long time, and you deserve the same kindness you would offer, without hesitation, to someone you love. One breath. Let that kindness arrive. You do not need to believe it fully tonight. You just need to let it in for one breath. And for the part of you that learned to disappear, the part that has been waiting quietly through all these years. It does not have to hide anymore. Not tonight, not here. Just for this moment, it is safe to be all the way here. Chapter 36, a quiet reflection on healing. And so we come to the end of tonight's journey. Not the end of the work. Healing is not a destination. Not even the end of the understanding. There is always more to see. But the end of this particular night's conversation, we began with a simple observation. There is a kind of quiet that does not feel like rest, a weight in the chest without a name, a familiar heaviness that arrives when the day ends and the noise clears and there is nowhere left to go but inside. We followed that weight through the territory that Gabor Maté and Carl Jung mapped from different directions across a lifetime of work. Through the body that keeps the record, through the nervous system that learned to brace, through the childhood that asked for authenticity and received the lesson that belonging mattered more, through the shadow that holds what we could not afford to look at, through the persona that became more real than the face beneath it, through the dream life, the complexes, the patterns that repeat, through the wounded healer who found wisdom in the wound, through the myth of normal and the archetypes of suffering and the long, patient interior work of becoming whole, we come back to where we began, to the weight, to the quiet. Except perhaps the quiet is a little different now. Perhaps the body has settled a little further into whatever holds it. Perhaps the breath has found a slightly slower rhythm. Perhaps the part of you that was managing has been given, in these hours, something it did not know it needed: permission. Permission to be a person who has been carrying something difficult, and to know that the carrying was not a failure, that the adaptation was intelligent, that the suppression was a form of survival. that the patterns that cause suffering now were once the best available response to something that required a response, and permission now to let the understanding begin to do its slow and patient work. You do not have to be healed by morning. You do not have to arrive anywhere tonight. The authentic self that learned to disappear, it has been listening through all of this, and it is still here. Before you sleep, here is a 7-day path. Not a program, not a plan. Just 7 small invitations, one for each of the coming days. Carry them lightly, or set them aside, or return to them in a week or in a year. They will be here. Day 1, hear your own voice. Tomorrow, for just a few moments, listen to how you speak to yourself, not to change it, just to hear it. Is it kind? Is it tired? Is it harsh? You do not need to do anything yet. Awareness is the first step, and it is enough for today. Day 2, 1 kind sentence. At some point tomorrow, say one kind thing to yourself, silently or aloud. Something like, I am doing the best I can, and that counts. It will feel unfamiliar. Let it feel unfamiliar. Say it anyway. Day 3, notice the body. 3 times during the day, pause and check where your body is holding tension. Your jaw, your shoulders, your hands. You do not need to release it, just know it is there. Noticing is a form of care. Day 4, name the feeling. When an emotion arrives, try to give it one honest word. Not fine, not stressed, something more specific. Tired, sad, relieved, afraid. Naming a feeling is not the same as solving it, but it changes how you carry it. Day 5, let one thing be unfinished. Choose one thing you have been holding open, a worry, an unresolved feeling, an unanswered question, and let it be unresolved for just today. Not forever, just today. Notice the small relief of setting it down, even briefly. Day 6, offer yourself what you give others. Think of the quality of care you extend to the people you love most, the patience, the benefit of the doubt, the understanding. Today, find one small moment to extend that same quality to yourself. It is not selfishness. It is the beginning of a different relationship with your own interior. Day 7, sit with the quiet. Tonight, before sleep, sit or lie in silence for just 2 minutes. No audio, no phone, just you and the dark. Let whatever comes, come. You do not have to make this profound. You just have to let it be quiet. And trust that quiet, for a mind like yours, is enough. The wound beneath the mind does not heal in a single night. But tonight, it has been seen. It has been named. And something that is seen and named is no longer entirely in shadow. Your body has been keeping a record. Tonight, the record includes this. You sat with something difficult. You listened. You did not look away. And that, in the long work of becoming whole, is not nothing. That is, in fact, exactly where it begins. Sleep now. The night will hold you.